Today's daf we're going to learn is Eruvin Daf Nuntet. Moadim l'simcha to everybody. Today's daf is dedicated by Gita and David Neufeld as a zchut for our dear friend and mentor Chaya Bat Osna Rachel, a fierce advocate for Jewish education b'toch sha'ar cholei Yisrael. We are blessed by her friendship and leadership. Okay, we're going to start again from the Mishnah on Nun Chet Amud Bet. Ein modidin ela min hamumche. Okay, so there's two different explanations, but we'll stick with that this means you need an expert to do the measuring. Some people explain it a little bit differently. So let's say I start my measuring, and in general, they would measure on the diagonal, the longest spot, the 2,800. So I start measuring in one direction, and then I measure in the other direction. And if I would draw a line between, let's say I'm going out east and west, and if I measure how far north I got, because I'm going basically on a diagonal, if I measure how far north I got, so I'm going to end up, both my lines aren't in a straight line. One is a little farther out than the other. So we go lemakom sheriba. Okay, we basically go to the farther one. We'll see in a minute that the Gemara is going to question this line. It sounds like we only go lemakom sheriba and not to the smaller one, and that doesn't make any sense, which obviously they're going to say that's not what it meant. Then it said this line, which we didn't understand. If one is longer, one is shorter, then we go by the longer one. Didn't we just say that? We'll get to that in the Gemara also. And then we have this last line, which I want to deal with a little bit more before we move on. Afilu eved, afilu shifcha, even a servant or a maidservant, both of those, a Canaanite slave, servant or slave, ne'emanim lomar ad kan tchum Shabbat. They can testify, we know that this is where the tchum is, and we believe them. Because all of this was meant to be a lenient law. Well, I'll have to talk about exactly what that line means also in a bit. So there's two very interesting Tosfots here on the page. And in fact, in the Hebrew site in Hadran, there's one article about can women be mashgiachs, okay, kashrus mashgiachs. There's an article about it by Tanya Regev in Hebrew, which basically talks about how this sugya is used as the basis for that. Okay, the sugya, and as Tosfot quotes it, it's one of the sugyas used. There's a number of times across the Gemara, they talk about there's two issues here. Number one, it sounds like meaning, right, there's a concept that normally we take two witnesses for anything, but there's certain things that we allow when it comes to is something allowed or not. We allow one witness to testify. So is this part of that category or not? That's a good question, because it says an eved or a shifcha are believed. So Tosfot actually suggests, Tosfot basically, what Tosfot likes to do is quote contradictory sugyot. And Tosfot says, I'm just moving off the women's issue for a minute, getting into the one witness. Tosfot says, it says in another place that if there's a child can say when the child gets older, okay, normally a child can't testify. But here's an interesting case. A grown-up comes and says, I remember when I was a child that this is where the Tchum Shabbat was. Now, we all know that when you're a child, right, do you remember everything the way it was? Sometimes we remember things being much bigger than they were, right? Things like that. But anyway, we say we believe a grown-up who says, when I was a child, the Tchum was there. However, the Gemara then says, well, it's only if someone else is testifying with him, because one witness isn't enough for this. And then they say, well, here it sounds like there's one witness. So Tosfot suggests maybe it means they're with someone else. It's just a matter of, can we accept an eved or a shifcha with somebody else? Okay, they could be two shvachot or two avadim. That doesn't matter. But that it's not an issue that we believe one witness, and that's based on a parallel sugya where it seems to imply that it wouldn't work unless you were two. Then Tosfot comes up with the issue of women, and he says, because the Mishnah basically says the whole reason why we're going to accept the eved or shifcha is because it's d'Rabbanan, which seems to imply that if it's d'oraita, and Gefet, the parak of Gefet this week with Yael Shimoni is all about, which is on Hadran's site, is all about these two Tosfots. Okay, she does a real solid learning of the two Tosfots inside. It's very interesting. And basically Tosfot here says, and it's a very famous Tosfot, which is, it sounds like if it was d'oraita, we wouldn't believe them. Now that's problematic, because if you go to someone's house and the person is shomer Shabbat and they tell you my house is kosher, you can believe them. And here Tosfot quotes that we know that we believe women who are generally not acceptable testimony in a court. That's a whole other topic we'll get to later. But women's testimony is not admissible in court. okay, just like the one witness and just like the Eved or the Shifcha. And he says, but we believe women when it comes to shchita and nikor, ulitram challah. Like if she says, I took challah from my bread, so we believe her and you can eat her stuff. And you can believe her that the shchita was done properly. All these things you can believe. And those are all d'oraita. So why does it seem to imply here it's only because it's d'Rabbanan? So Tosfot comes up with a very famous distinction here. He says all those women are believed because it's biyada. She's capable of changing it, of fixing it. She can do it herself. If she can do it herself, then we're going to believe her, because the assumption is if she didn't do it and she wants to tell you that it is, so she'll fix it so that it's right. Like I took my truma to Maasrod and I took my challah, and she could always just fix it. So therefore we believe her. It's an interesting theory that because she can fix it, we believe her. But here, tchumin, it's not in her control at all, right? She doesn't decide the tchum. That's something out of her control. Therefore, she's only going to be believed if it's d'Rabbanan. But if it's Torah law, then no. Then he brings another question, which is, well, bedikat chametz, checking for chametz, okay? That's a d'Rabbanan law. You don't have to do a bedikat chametz according to the Torah. You have to make sure you don't have chametz in your house before Pesach, but you don't have to do the actual bedikat chametz that we all do. That's a d'Rabbanan law. It says there that women are not believed. Okay, sorry. It says women are believed, but why are they believed? Because it's d'Rabbanan. Now, see, right? So women can say we did b'dikat chametz here. Okay, now here's a really interesting thing Tosfot says. You might not like this, but they say, why would we believe them only because it's d'Rabbanan? Again, this is something they can easily do b'dikat chametz, or maybe easily is not the right word, and that's what we're going to see. But they can do b'dikat chametz, and because they can do b'dikat chametz, it's biyadat, should be even if it's d'oraita. So this again doesn't seem to fit with the rule that Tosfot just gave. So what does Tosfot say? Maybe they're just trying to fit it into their rule, but they say women are often lazy. And okay, I don't know if they're saying women necessarily are often lazy, but he's suggesting that maybe the women will be lazy and they don't really want to do b'dikat chametz. It's a bit of a pain to do it thoroughly and properly. So therefore, they'll just say it was done. Okay, so he has to add another factor. Has to be biyada, but not too much of a difficulty so that she won't be lazy about it. I have to wonder why shchita's there. That doesn't sound like it's something so easy to do either. But anyway, that's what Tosfot says. And that's a very famous Tosfot in terms of it's very relevant. And that's why Tanya Regev wrote this article, Can Women Be Mashkichot Kashrut? Because if they're believable when it comes to kashrus issues, even on a d'oraita level, then we should theoretically be able to have them be mashkichot kashrut. She brings two different piskei halacha about whether or not they can do this. Okay, anyway, and what's interesting about her article is she shows there about how different poskim, how they take certain things into consideration when they do a psik halacha. Like one of the rabbis was Moshe Feinstein, and there was a woman in front of him who was a widow, and her husband was a mashkiach kashrut. He died, and she wanted to kind of take over his business, and it was a parnasa issue, and she needed the money, and and he basically allows her to do it. Whereas this other rabbi was talking in a theoretical plane, and maybe because of that, he didn't really see a real life situation in front of him. Anyway, these are all interesting things. We're going to move on now back to our Gemara. Okay, generally we stick to the Gemara, but these were too interesting not to go off on the tangent about them. Okay, starting with the Gemara now. So as I said, they're going to make two strange assumptions of how to read the Gemara, the Mishnah, in a way that wasn't really the way we read it. So sometimes it's a little hard to understand where they're coming from because that's not how we read it. But you have to imagine, I didn't read you the Mishnah the way I did. But literally, when you read the Mishnah, it sounds like if ribala makom echad u'mi'et l'makom acher, right? You made one line a little bit longer, one line a little bit shorter. You can go l'makom sheriba, which sounds like l'makom sheriba in l'makom shemi'et lo. It sounds like you can't go to where the shorter line is, which obviously doesn't make any sense. So ema af l'makom sheriba. What it really means to say is even to the place where you extended it farther than the other, we can be lenient and assume, right? You obviously made a mistake in one place, but we can assume your mistake was to in the shorter line and not the longer line. Next line. Ribala echad u'mi'et lechad. Now we had to understand, what does this Mishnah mean? This line in the Mishnah. Hatu lama li hainu hach. Isn't that the exact same as the previous line? So they say hachi kamar. This is what it meant to say. Riba echad u'mi'et echad shom'im lezeh sheriba. If two of us, this is not one person measured two lines, both of us measured the line in the same place, my line came out to a different place than your line did, right? We know there's always some sort of margin of error. So one of us measured farther than the other. So then we say we can go by the farther one. But Amar Abaye, ubavad shelo yarbe yoter mi midat ha'ir ba'alach sona. Remember when we draw this angle, it's the hypotenuse. And what's the hypotenuse? It's not 2,000, it's 2,800. So he says, as long as there's not 800 cubits of difference between my measurement and your measurement, if there's more, then we're going to say there's really some serious error here. If there's 800 or less, then we can assume, okay, either there was just a small mistake in the measuring, or the more likely assumption, Abaye says, is that, let's say mine was longer than yours, that you thought that we measured 2,000 on the hypotenuse. They assume that people made mistakes in this law because they think, oh, you only get 2,000 cubits even on a diagonal. And I knew that you get 2,800. So I measured 2,800 and you measured 2,000. And that's why we can assume that up to 800, we can assume it was based on that error, okay? That was exactly the error of this issue, that you thought it was only 2,000, I thought 2,800, and that's why we obviously then go by my measurement, because my measurement is the right one, because you really do get 2,800. Next line, and this sugya appears exactly identical in Nida. Okay, Masechet Nida, when it comes to ktamim, spotting. Okay, spotting is a chumrah of the rabbis. Okay, normally you have to have a flow of blood to be considered impure, but what if you have spotting? So the rabbis were stringent because there were relevant issues for tumah, for laws of impurity in the temple. They also forbade a woman to her husband if she has spotting, but because it's all just a chumrah, so they're lenient. And it says exactly the same thing there. Lo amru chachamim et hadavar lakel ela lachmir, and the same sugya appears here, which again, we're going to allow this because it's all, okay, so now you have to read, how do we read this? So lo amru chachamim et hadavar lakel ela lachmir. Okay, so now they say there's a different brayta that says, what do you mean? This isn't right. Our line in the Mishnah said, "Lo amru chachamim et hadavar lahachmir ela lahakel." The rabbis, right, in our Mishnah it says the rabbis added Isur Tchumin to be lenient, and the Braita says, "Lo amru chachamim et hadavar lahakel ela lahachmir." Isur Tchumin is a chumrah, right? Now that's how you would say it, right? The rabbis, when they decided, either again, we saw two different explanations. Either it means to institute Isur Tchumin in general, or it means Isur Tchumin midoraita is 12 meal, which is a much larger space. And the rabbis were stringent and made it 2,000 amot. And therefore, we're going to say, right, so this is all a chumrah. It's not a leniency, it's a chumrah. So Amar Ravina, and again, this is a strange question because we understood what it meant in the first place, but they're saying something's wrong with the wording here because somewhere else it says the exact opposite wording. So Ravina says, now what does it mean? Lo lahakel al divrei Torah, ela lachmir al divrei Torah. Yes, it was meant as a stringency, the whole concept of it. But Tchumin de Rabbanan, but the whole law is de Rabbanan, and therefore we can be lenient when it comes to details about this law. Okay, so it means basically, in theory, the whole thing of Isur Tchumin is a stringency, but because it's all a stringency, therefore one can be lenient. Okay, that's again, this is obvious from the beginning, but they're kind of dealing with the language used in the Mishnah, and it sounds a little bit confusing. New Mishnah. Now we're switching topics. Okay, this is kind of associative. We got to this. We're going to switch to, until now we've been talking for a while already about Isur, about Eruv Tchumin. We're now going back to Eruv Chatzerot, which is carrying. Okay, just to confuse you a little bit, we're moving into that. We're going to go back after this to Eruv Tchumin. And when we get to the next chapter, we're going to start again with, we're going back to Eruv Chatzerot and making an Eruv. But right now we're still in Eruv Tchumin. We just are diverging for this Mishnah to talk about Eruv Chatzerot. Ir shel Yachid, and we already quoted this Mishnah earlier in the Gemara. Ir shel Yachid v'naset shel Rabim. We have a city that belongs to an individual. We don't know exactly what this means yet. I'll give you some options in a minute. And it becomes shel Rabim. Okay, the city changes. We all know this happens all the time, where a city will, urbanization, or right, where a city becomes much bigger population. So what is an Ir shel Yachid? We have a difference of opinion between Rashi and Chachmei Sfarad. Okay, the ones living in Spain, like the Rashba and the Ritva. So Rashi says, Ir shel Yachid shelo hayu nechnesim ba tamid shishim ribo shel bnei adam. That you don't normally have 600,000 people coming in. V'lo chashiva reshut harabim de lo damya lediglei midbar. You learned it from the desert, 600,000. This is a very famous Rashi because Rashi says this here and in one other place. He brings in this concept of, and I talked about this from the beginning, that Rashi says that in order for something to be considered a Reshut Harabim, besides all the criteria it says in the Torah of open on, in the Gemara, of open on both sides and 16 cubits wide and, all different criteria, Rashi adds, you have to have 600,000 people. Now, you have to fill in the blank. Even that is a debate, what he means. 600,000 people walking on the main drag per day, 600,000 people living in the city, population of 600,000 people walking around the city, right? It's not clear. And this leads to all sorts of huge debates. Number one, do we hold by this 600,000? Now, this is very relevant. You can have a city that's all the criteria of Rishut Rabim. It has a big main drag, opens up on both sides. It's 16 cubits wide, but we don't have either 600,000 people wandering through there on a daily basis or living in the city or whatever you want to say. And, right, do we call this a Rishut Rabim? Now, why is it so important if we call it a Rishut Rabim? Because remember, an Eruv can only be put up in something that's not a Rishut Rabim midoraita, right? A Torah law can only be in a Carmelite, something that's like a Rishut Rabim, but doesn't have all the criteria. So if we say that that's a criteria, then we can take a big city that has all the other aspects of Rishut Rabim, but there aren't 600,000 people, again, fill in the blank, whichever way you go. And we can say, we can put up an Eruv. And other people will say, Rashi kind of made that up. No, some of them are first time, we don't hold by that. It doesn't say that in the Gemara anywhere. And therefore, no, this is a Rishut Rabim and you can't make an Eruv here. And that's why we have big debates about, can you put up an Eruv in this city? Can you put up an Eruv in this city, right? There's big debates about this. And part of it has to do, there's all different issues. One of the big debates is, do we hold by Rashi or not? So, and then even if we hold by Rashi, to what, right? How do we do the 600,000? How do we calculate that? Okay. So it's a big, very important question. So here we have, according to Rashi, an Ir Sheyachid means we didn't have a big population and it turned into a big population. According to the Rashba and others in Spain, they said, no. Ir Sheyachid means it belonged to an individual and he either sold it or rented it out to people or is something like that, which we're going to see in the Gemara actually further on. And that's what it means in Ir Sheyachid and Shel Rabim. It doesn't have to do with size of population necessarily. It does have to do with size, but not Shishim Ribo. It's just that it belonged to one person and then got sold. You know, like I think about in Ranana, for example, I give a lot of examples today from Ranana. I happen to live there. So it's just but you know, like I live on a street where almost all the property was owned by one family years ago. Now there's lots and lots of houses there, but you know, that's how places start. They start with one person owns this big space and then they start selling it to people and then people start moving in and that's how it happens. So if it was an Ir Sheyachid and then it becomes Shel Rabim, Ma'arvin et kula, you can make an Eruv around the entire city. Okay, the assumption Rashi says is that even if it becomes Shel Rabim, it still doesn't have all the criteria of Rishut Rabim. Again, because if it was Rishut Rabim proper, you wouldn't be able to make an Eruv. But here you can make an Eruv in the whole city. V'shel Rabim v'naset shel Yachid. But if it was the reverse, that originally was a city of Rabim, okay, the idea of that as being an Ir Shel Yachid is that it's always kind of considered like an individual city because it started small, so we still view it as small. But Shel Rabim v'naset shel Yachid, if it belonged to many and then it becomes only individuals, right? People move out and it's now a very small place. Ein Marvin et Kula, since it was still an Ir Shel Rabim, people still perceive it as, we talked about this last time, we said this, how, it's hard for us to change our perceptions about things and people and all that. So because our perceptions don't change so easily, even though the city changed, we still view it in the old way. And therefore you can only do it, you have to leave over a certain section. They have 50 people living there. You have to keep out a certain section of the Eruv to show that we know this was once an Ir Shel Rabim, and therefore, even though now it's an Ir Shel Yachid and we can make an Eruv, but we want to remind ourselves so that people don't think that we can make an Eruv in other big cities, and therefore you leave over a space of 50 people. Divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, shalosh chatzirot shel shnei batim. No, the minimum they have to leave over is much smaller. 3 courtyards with 2 houses each, that's enough. That's like a unit. Okay. Gemara starts off. What's the case? So, Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Kigon de Iskatia de Reish Galuta. It's like the city of the Reish Galuta, which first just the Reish Galuta lived there, but then he ended up with lots of people that worked for him, and the city grew, and now there's more people living in the city. Amar le Rav Nachman, my taima. So why do you call this an Ir Shel Yachid? And why is it going to be okay here? And the people, and the whole idea is, why will people still think of it as an Ir Shel Yachid? So he questions and he says, is it because Elam, and he's going to say, if that's the reason, I'm going to reject it, mishum deshchiche baharmana midkare hadade, because people go This is a city that was built around the Reish Galuta, which means anytime you need something, you go to the Reish Galuta. He gives out the permits and it's kind of like the municipality building. So because there's this space at the Reish Galuta that everybody's coming for all sorts of reasons, so therefore they congregate there. And we all know there were lots of meals that went on there also, and people were always congregating there. So because people congregate there, we're going to say, well, then Midkarei Hadadi, they're going to remind each other that the only reason why we can do an Eruv here in the whole city is because this was originally a smaller city. Well, if that's the case, Kuli Yisrael Nami, but Safra Hadadi, in any city that, any other city will have the same thing where even if it was in Yersha Yachid and now more people live, like any city where, let's say, it was a small population, and not that it was all based on the Reish Galuta, but any small population, and now it grew. So every week they get together in the shul. Okay, by the way, most people say the shul wasn't for davening here. It was, they would get together for the drasha. They would go learn on Shabbat. So they would get together every Shabbat. So they'd also remind each other. In other words, if you're looking for a place where people congregate, you can have that in any city, basically. Right? Interesting in light now that we can't really congregate in shuls like we used to, but that's like a Jewish thing, right? We congregate all the time in the synagogues. So now they say, Ela Amar Rav Nachman, so therefore it can't be the Reish Galuta, because that if your reason is that, well, that doesn't work. So it must be something else. Amar Rav Nachman, Kigon Diskata de Nitzoi, the city of Nitzoi. Okay, now what's unique about the city of Nitzoi? So it doesn't tell you. So different options are brought. One is that he owned everything in the city, as I described before, like the Rashba thought we were talking about from the beginning. He owned everything in the city, and then he rents it out to everybody else. So it's called his city because he rents everything out, and everything therefore is called in his name. Another possibility is he originally owned everything in the city and he sold it to people. It's no longer all his, but it's still called in his name because he was the one who sold it to everybody. And some people say it doesn't even mean, right? It could mean he started the city. The whole point is that the city is named for him. So if the city, the name of the city is named for an individual, then already it just has to do with the name. Then everybody views it as, right? Thanks for the examples you're bringing, like Hershey, Pennsylvania, or Levittown, New York, right? These are cities named for individuals. So it has a character, or people think of it as an individual city. And that's a good question. Like, do people view Hershey, Pennsylvania as belonging to Hershey? Maybe. Levittown, I don't think people say, oh, it's Levitt's town. Nobody really views it that way. It just became a name. But if you, right, the question is, how do we view this? So if we say the name is enough, then maybe the name is enough to just say, well, because of that, it'll remind everybody that this city is different than every other city. Okay, so now, Tanu Rabbanan. Now we're going to get into details of how exactly we can do this. So we have a city that was in a Yachid, again, however you decide what a Yachid is, it becomes Shel Rabim. We have a main drag that goes straight through. So how do we do an Eruv here? You don't need to put up doors or anything. It's enough to just put up, okay, we're back to our post or crossbeam, right? Standing up or vertically, okay? And then you can carry in between. But there's one but. You can't split the city into two Eruvs, half and half. We're going to get to this soon, what this means. Ella. O kula o mavoy mavoy b'fnei atzmo. You have two possibilities. Either you do the whole city as one, or you do each individual alley by itself. Okay, we're going to see only later in the Gemara why those are the only two possibilities. Now we're going to move on. Before we get really into detail and understanding that, we're going to get back to that later and understand it better soon. So again, what can you do? You have a main drag going through. It's open on both sides. You can put up a lechi or korah, and that's sufficient. You don't need a tzurat petach. You don't need a door. That's fine. Because it was an Ir Shel Yachid. And what else don't you need that we already said? You don't need to leave a section that's not part of the Eruv, which you would have to do if it was an Ir Shel Rabim that became Shel Yachid. Now the Gemara says, Hayta Shel Rabim. Now we're moving into the next case. What if it was Rabim? V'harei Shel Rabim. And it's still Rabim. In other words, you have a big city. But what doesn't it have? And that's, normally that would be a Rishut Rabim, as long as what? The main drag opens up both sides to the outside. But ein la ela petach echad. But if it only has one entrance, meaning you can only get into the city in one way, it's not open on both sides. In that case, ma'arvin et kula. Then you can actually make an Eruv in the entire city. Even though it was Rabim and it's still Rabim, because it's missing this one important part, you can make an Eruv in the whole city. What it doesn't talk about is what if it was Rabim and still Rabim and it is open on both sides, okay? So the assumption is a few things. Number one, right? You'd have to leave a section out of the Eruv. Remember, that's what we talked about before, okay? And you'd have to also you'd have to fix the opening on both sides, right? You'd have to make like a door or something like that. You'd have to kind of fix that much more significantly than just a lechi or a korah. Mantana de me'arva reshut harabim. Okay, this implies that you can make an eruv in, right? We just said in the first case, you have a reshut harabim that's open on both sides, and you can make an eruv. You can put a lechi on either side, right? And it was a case where it was a yachid. Now it became shel rabim. You're allowed to put a lechi or a korah and a korah. Who is this going according to? Amrafuna Barid Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yehuda. This must be Rabbi Yehuda. If you remember, we learned this a few times. Titanya, Yeter, okay, and after Rabbi Yehuda gives some big heter, he says, and even more so, I'll add another one. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, Misheyesh lo shnei batim, b'shnei tzidei reshut harabim. I own the house on this side of the street, and I own the house on the other side of the street, but there's a public thoroughfare going through. What do we say? Oseh lechi mikan v'lechi mikan. I could put up a lechi on one house and a lechi in front of my other house. Oh, korah mikan, or a crossbeam on both sides. The korah mikan, v'noseh v'notem ba'emtza, and I can carry in between the two houses. If you remember, we had a whole discussion there. It's because he holds that 2 walls are sufficient. Once you have 2 walls, all you need to do is add a little something for the 3rd wall, and that's sufficient. The rabbis disagree with him and say, no way. You need 3 walls, and then you can put up a lechi or a korah. This doesn't work. But he thought that it works, and therefore, he says, this must be the same thing where we have basically an irsha yachid, and then, right, there was yachid, now it's rabim. We have this main thoroughfare. It's enough to put up a lechi and a korah on either side. Okay, it must be Rabbi Yehuda. And Amru Lo, here we're just quoting that source about Rabbi Yehuda, Aim Arvim Rishad Arvim B'kach. And the rabbis say, no way, you can't do that. So our sugya must go like Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Mar, now we're going to get to this chatza'in. Ve'aim Arvino Tala chatza'in. You can't split the city in half. So we're going to have 2 versions of Rav Papa about how it can't be split in half, and maybe there's a way it can be. Amar Rav Papa, Lo Amru Ela Le'orka, Aval Le'rochba Ma'arvin. Okay, what does this mean? I'm going to take Ranana as an example. For those who aren't familiar with Ranana, I'm going to explain to you the way Ranana works, and I'm going to ignore part of, okay, Ranana has 2 main drags. There's Rehov Achusa and there's Rehov Weitzman. Let's just ignore Weitzman for now. Let's just assume it has 1 main drag, okay? This is typical for like old Israeli cities, right? There's 1 main strip where all the stores are, and then everything else is around there. So there's this 1 main street, and it's perfect, right? We talked the other day how it opens to Kfar Saba on one side and Herzliya on the other, right? And the main drag, basically, that's how you get from Ranana from Kfar Saba to Herzliya. You go straight through Ranana, so it's it's got 1 street open on both sides, and everybody kind of goes out both those sides, okay? Now, Achuza runs east-west, okay? So this is what they say. You can't split it le'orkan. You can't say all the people north of Achuza can do an Eruv, and all the people south of Achuza can do an Eruv with each other. That doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? It's very simple. Because if you think about it, so there's 2 exits to Ranana. One is on the east and one is on the west. The people on the north and the people on the south on the eastern side all use the eastern exit. And the people on the west side all use the west exit. So that means if we split it up north-south, everybody uses Achuza to get out of the city. So the people north of Achuza and the people south of Achuza are going to be using Achuza in the same space. They share space. So like we always say, when it comes to Eruv, if we share space, we all have to be part of the Eruv together. We can't have someone being forbidden to carry with someone else in the same shared space. So since they all share that exit, therefore, they're going to share Achuza in that spot. And it's not like the people in the north only go to the north side of Achuza and the people on the south only go to the south side. So basically, you can't split it north-south, but you can split it east-west. And why is Ranana a perfect example? Because when people talk about Ranana and the residential area, they always talk about, do you live on the east or do you live on the west, right? And everyone always says you're on the other side of town, right? Because the other side is not north-south. The other side is east-west. This makes perfect sense with the sugya saying. If you want to split it east-west, that's great because people on the east go out the east exit and people on the west go out the west exit. And therefore there's no crossover between them basically, right? They could say this part of Achuz is mine and this part of Achuz is mine. Now it's not exactly true. And we'll see that in the second version of Rav Papa, because the main drag is still the main drag and everybody uses the main drag, but you could see why there's logic that if we're going to say it can be split in some way, we're going to say it can be split east-west and not north-south. Okay, again, the directions aren't important. It's a matter of where the main drag is. You can't split the main drag and say half the main drag, on one side of the main drag is this way, on the other side is another way. You'd have to say split the main drag 50-50. There's those use that exit, those use that exit. That's the first understanding of our papa. So when it says you can't be marev l'chatzain, it means only l'orkav and not l'rochba. So now they say, Keman, and who does this hold like? Delo Rabbi Akiva. This must be not like Rabbi Akiva. Why? De'ik Rabbi Akiva ha'amal regel hamuteret b'mkoma oseret afilu shelo b'mkoma. Right? A regel, if I'm allowed to walk in a certain space, it forbids space that even if it's not my space, I can still forbid it since I can get there. Okay, now he's talking about a bit of a different case. Let me explain it better. He's talking about where there's two courtyards. One is inner, okay? One is the inner, one is the outer. Now the inner courtyard walks through the outer courtyard. Let's say these two courtyards each do an Eruv Chatzerot. We're now not talking about for the city, we're just talking about within a courtyard. I make an Eruv in mine, I live in the inner part, and you live in the outer part, you make an Eruv in yours. But we don't make an Eruv together, right? I make with the people in my courtyard and you make with your courtyard. But since our courtyard walks through your courtyard, so what does he say? He says, "A regel hamuteret b'mkoma." I'm allowed in my courtyard, but oseret afilu shelo b'mkoma. But I can forbid, since I can use your space, I can forbid you from having an eruv. So this is exactly like the east and the west side of Renana. Since everyone can walk on the chuzah on the east or the west side, since I'm allowed to walk, I live in the east, I can walk on the west side. I should forbid the people on the west. So that's why they say, this sugya that we just said, this opinion of our papa must hold not like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva says, if I can walk in the west, then I forbid the people in the west. I have to be together with them in the Eruv, otherwise their Eruv can't work. I can mess it up for them. Okay, so now, obviously the Gemara is going to say, wait, the Pnimi and the Chitzoni, the inner courtyard and the outer courtyard are not at all like the east and the west side of Renana. These are two different things, so don't connect them. You could say, Afilu Tema Rabbi Akiva, you could say Rabbi Akiva would even agree with Rav Papa. Because Rabbi Akiva why? The inner courtyard has no way to get out. Right? Where's the exit to the main drag? You have to walk through the other courtyard. That's why the inner courtyard forbids the outer courtyard. By the way, the rabbis disagree with him. The rabbis think inner courtyard can do an Eruv and outer courtyard can do an Eruv separately, and it's not a problem. He's the only one who thinks they can't. But the reason he says it is because the inner has no way to go other than getting out the outer courtyard. But here Rabbi Akiva would say, yeah, the east goes out the east, the west goes out the west, and yeah, we could view them as two totally separate areas. So we tried to say maybe it's not like Rabbi Akiva. In the end, we say they're not connected. Now we're going to have a whole second version of this whole sugya. Ika de Amre. Some people say, Amar Papa. Rav Papa said, Lo tema le'orkahu de lo marvin, aval le'rochba marvin. Don't say what we just suggested that Rav Papa said, that you can't do it lengthwise, but you can do it widthwise. Ela afilu le'rochba nami lo marvin. But you can't even do east-west. In other words, the whole city has to be together. Okay. Otherwise, what else can you do? We already said, or each individual alley. But that's not what we're talking about. Right now, we're just talking about the whole city versus half the city. You can't ever do half, not in any direction. So now the Gemara says, Kiman, ki Rabbi Akiva. What is he saying? This just according to Rabbi Akiva. Again, we're connecting Rabbi Akiva. Both versions connect Rabbi Akiva because we're going to say, even though they don't necessarily use that space, they could use that space and therefore they forbid it. And therefore the East can forbid the West. So they say, no. Afilu tema Rabbanan. Now we're going to go the opposite direction. You could even say that the rabbis, last time we tried to say even Rabbi Akiva would allow to split east-west. Now we're going to say even the rabbis who permitted it in the two courtyards would forbid it in the east-west. Why? The pnimi can shut the door and only use its own space. In other words, what's the difference between the two courtyards and the east and west side of Renana? There's no clear border. There's no demarcation. There's no wall in between the east and the west, right? It's not like West Berlin and East Berlin. There's no wall in between. So what is there? There's, wait, East Berlin used to be. Anyway, but in between the two courtyards, there's a wall. And now there's a debate about how to read this. Some people say the outer courtyard can say to the inner courtyard, we're not letting you walk through our courtyard on Shabbat. Some people say there's no way they could say that. What kind of craziness? That's like cruel, right? Not letting them out. But the main thing is, some people say, no, what it really means is that, that the outer courtyard can say, you don't have rights. Yes, you can walk through, but you have no rights in our courtyard. And basically then say, we're two separate spaces. Okay, you can maybe walk through, but that's it. You can't do anything else in our courtyard. Some people say it's the inner courtyard can close themselves in. They can say, we're shutting the door and we don't want to have anything to do with you. And we don't want to walk out, closure, right? There's a closure. We're not leaving our houses today. So if they were to do that, they could theoretically be their own space. And that's why the rabbis say it's okay. But when you're talking about the east and the west side of Ra'anana, no one on the east can forbid the people on the west from coming into their space. No way. The achuza is for everybody, right? The space is everywhere. And therefore, you can't say that it's right. It's not the same case. And maybe even the rabbis would agree that you can't do east-west, but you could do inner-outer courtyard. Right. Achta ledasha mishtamsha means they could shut the door. The dasha is the door, the gate. They could shut the door and then mishtamesh and then just use their own space. But in this case, mimatsu misalke rishid rabbi mehacha. No one can prevent anyone else from getting into the public space. It's public space, right? The two chatzerot are not public space. Amar, next line. Now we still have left to figure out. O kula, o mavoim mavoim b'fnei atzmo. So now, why is it, right, one extreme or the other? Doesn't make any sense, right? Why? So they say, Ma'ishna de lachatzaim delo de asrei hadade. Why can't you do half-half? Because that basically means you can't come into my space. I can't come into your space, right? And that's, since I can come into your space and you can come into my space, we all have to be together in order for it to work. Again, this goes back to our original example of the 5 people living in a courtyard and one of them isn't part of the Eruv, right? And he messes it up for all the other people. Because if we all share space, then we all have to be together in the Eruv if we want to carry. So if that's the case, and we say you can't do lechatzaim because everybody can walk everywhere, well then mavoy will be this nami asra hadade. Every street, people can go walk into alleyways all around, right? I can walk into any alleyway I want in Ra'anana. I can't walk into your house, but if there's a cul-de-sac, I can walk in there if I want, right? Nobody's going to stop me from doing that. So why shouldn't I be able to forbid you from making an Eruv? So what are the answer? Hachabamaskina kigon de avid daka. Okay, now we're going to open our pictures for today. The case is picture number 219, where each mavoy made its own little wall. Okay, you see it looks like a tzurata petach with a wall. It kind of closes up the whole entrance of the mavoy, leaving kind of an open entranceway area there. So if they did it that way, okay, that's the only way you could do mavoy. And here you see all the mavoys look that way in the picture. If you look further back in the picture, if they did it that way, then each one is basically saying, it's a way of saying, please don't come into my street unless you live here. And then we can do our own separate thing. The Chihad Amar Rav Idi Bar Avin, and it's like Rav Idi Bar Avin said, Amar Rav Chisda, in the name of Rav Chisda, Echami b'nei mavoy she'asa daka lepitcho, eno oser b'nei mavoy. This is interesting. We talked about 5 people living in a courtyard, and if one of them doesn't join the Eruv, it's no good. But in fact, he says that if one of them puts up an enclosure in front of his house, basically saying, I don't want anyone coming into my courtyard, then all the other members of the courtyard, or I don't want anyone coming into my house, all the other members of the courtyard could do an Eruv without him because he's basically setting himself aside. So therefore, just like he said it by Chatzer, we could say it also by Mavoy, and that must be what we're talking about. Okay, right, this is a line. It was Shel Rabim, and then, sorry, I want to go back. Which line are we going back to? Right, this is the last line on Nun Tet Amud Aleph. We quoted a bright Tasha Rabim Baharei Shel Rabim ve'en la'ela petach echad ma'arvin et kula. Okay, it was belonged to many people, and then it was still belonging to many people, but it only has one exit to the public domain. Then you can do an Eruv in the whole city. Rabbi Zera arva lamata debei Rabbi Chia v'lo shavik la shiur. So Rabbi Zera made an Eruv in the city of Rabbi Chia, and he didn't leave over any space. Now remember, why can you do that? So we're going to see. Either you can do it for 2 reasons, really, and this will kind of set up the whole sugya for you. If you say, either you can say it was the Shel Yachid and it became Shel Rabim, And that's why you don't need to leave any part out of the city. You can make an Eruv for the whole city. Or you could say it was Shel Rabim and it's still Rabim, but it only is open on one side. The issue is that we had a city here that was open on both sides. So we assume it wasn't option number 2. It must have been option number 1. So let's see what happened here. So Rabbi Zera made an Eruv Debei Rabbi Chia in the house, in this Lamata Debei Rabbi Chia, in the house, in the city of where Rabbi Chia's house was. V'lo shavak lashur, he didn't leave anything over. Amar le Abai, Abai comes to him and says, my time Avid Marhachi, why did you do that? You can't do an Eruv like that here. So Amar le, Sabi Dida, Marli, some older guy said to me, Rav Chia bar Asi ma'arev kula. Rav Chia bar Asi used to make an Eruv here, right? This is classic. You hear of something that happened generations ago. He said, yeah, in the olden days, he used to make an Eruv here, right? We haven't done it in years, but he used to. So what did Rabbi Zera say? He said, well, I made a logical assumption here. Amina, even though I didn't know this, but I can assume, Shema Mina, one can infer from here, this must have been a city that belonged to an individual, and then it became a public city, and that's why they were able to make an Eruv in the whole city without leaving over a section. Amar le, so Rabbi says to him, you got your facts wrong. Lididi amrule hanusabe. I heard from some other elders. Hahi ashba havalamicha gisa. It was for the second reason. There used to be a garbage dump on the other side of the city, which means on the other side of the main thoroughfare. So there was really only one exit of the city. Nobody exited by the garbage dump. The garbage dump blocked off the whole exit to the city. There used to be only one exit. But now, obviously, what happened? Hasha di ipanya. But now they've already cleared that away. Now it's like a city that has 2 openings and it's forbidden. So what's his reaction? Amarle, lavadate. I didn't know that. This is when you make certain assumptions and sometimes they're incorrect assumptions. And he says, oh, I guess I was wrong. Now it's really open on 2 sides and we can't do it. So now he asks a question. Sulam mikan. Here we get into an interesting question. If you have a city with an entrance on one side and on the other side, there's a ladder, there's a wall, but there's a ladder to climb over the wall. Does that mean it's accessible and people use it as an exit or not? So, sulam mikan upetach mikan mahu. So what's the case? Is this open on both sides or not? Amar lehachi amarav sulam torat petach halav. He says, Rav says that it's an entrance. So yeah, we can view this as an entrance. Now the city's open on 2 sides, can't make an Eruv. Amar lehu Rav Nachman lo tetzitule. Rav Nachman says, don't listen to him. Hachi amarav ad amarav. Rav Ada said in the name of Rav, you misunderstood. You only quoted half of it. Sulam torat petach halav v'torat mechitza halav. Sometimes a ladder is viewed as an opening, and sometimes it's viewed as a wall. Very interesting. Torat mechitza halav kedamaran. When is it a wall and like a boundary? Like our case. When it's an exit to the city, people aren't going to exit the city using a ladder, not if they can go out through an opening. No way. But Torat Petach Halav is in the next picture, in picture 221, Bisulam Shebein Shtei Chatzerot. If it's between our 2 houses, then it's more likely that I'll climb over to your house and you'll climb over to my house using this ladder. And therefore, in this case, and what's interesting about this case is it can go both directions. Ratzu echad ma'arev, ratzu shnayim ma'arvin. We can either, in this case, with a sulam, a ladder, in between our 2 houses, our 2 courtyards. If we want, we can make separate Eruvs. If we want, we can make an Eruv together. You can view this in both ways. Okay, but when it comes to a city, that's always viewed as a wall. Okay, we'll stop here for now. We'll continue more with the sugya tomorrow. Everyone, have a great day.